now. Alicia in London, hi.
Hi there.
Hey.
Hi.
What do you think?
So my point is, what the better question might be, why would Prince Harry and Meghan actually want to return as publicly funded royals? There were original conditions that caused them to step back, and one of them was press targeting, and we're sort of seeing that on the conversation today, where Emma and Kelvin are spreading misinformation, where they claim that it was the Harry and Meghan's attacks which ruined, caused all the problems. But as you yourself, Jeremy, have said, there were palace briefings against them, which started back in 2018, and even things like the story around, bridesmaid tears, that came from the palace. So as far as that type of thing is concerned, I can't see that condition has changed.
We've got to sort of park all that, haven't we? That's all water under the bridge now. We're going to assume we can. Let's say we can get them back, because let's say
my point.
I thought you said your point. Sorry.
Yeah, my point is that certain conditions, things like press targeting and press misinformation, hasn't changed. As far as I can see, there's still press attacks happening. Like, I've seen a really disgusting article saying that Meghan is worse than Andrew, which is obviously completely not true. And that is still going on today with complete silence from the royal family.
I don't know anything about what you just said. I don't know what that's all about. But,
exactly.
Yeah, so but listen, you've sort of said a lot there, and obviously predicated on all of this. Alicia, sorry, don't just keep talking. On all of this is predicated that we could get them back because they might want to come back. And you're quite right, Alicia. They might just say no.
Yeah, so my point is that where certain conditions haven't changed, they're going off and they're doing incredible work, as we're seeing in Jordan today, for example. They're supporting their causes, and they're doing it independent of public funding, and they're obviously able to. Yeah, exactly. So what would be the appeal to them for actually wanting to come back? It kind of seems that when things are going wrong with the royal family, then there's always these appeals that, maybe we should get Harry and Meghan back.
Welcome back, everyone, because tonight we need to talk about the narrative that just refuses to die. The claim that Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, are somehow on the verge of returning to royal life, that there's a secret plan, a quiet negotiation, a behind-the-scenes effort to pull them back into the institution they stepped away from. And yet, when you actually look at the facts instead of the fantasy, the entire story starts to collapse under its own weight. Because what we are really seeing is not a couple trying to get back in, but a system and a media machine that cannot accept that they walked away and built something that no longer depends on royal approval. And this became crystal clear during a recent discussion on Jeremy Vine, when a caller named Alicia calmly dismantled the talking points that have been repeated for years, asking the one question nobody pushing the return narrative ever seems able to answer. Why would they want to come back at all? Why would Prince Harry and Meghan, Duchess of Sussex, voluntarily return to the very conditions that pushed them out? Conditions that included relentless press hostility, public attacks, alleged palace briefings, and a level of scrutiny that went far beyond normal criticism into something far more personal and damaging. And Alicia's point was not emotional or dramatic, it was logical. She simply said, those conditions have not changed. The press environment has not suddenly become kinder. Misinformation still spreads at lightning speed. Hostile commentary still dominates certain headlines. And the silence that often follows those attacks has not disappeared either. So if the core problems remain exactly the same, what possible incentive would there be to step back into that storm? Especially when they are already doing globally recognized humanitarian work on their own terms, funded independently, accountable only to their own foundation and partners rather than to palace structures or taxpayer expectations. And this is the part of the story that gets conveniently ignored because it disrupts the narrative that they are somehow lost without royal status. The reality is, they are not only functioning without it, they are thriving in ways that traditional royal roles might never have allowed. Traveling internationally, spotlighting causes from mental health to humanitarian relief, partnering with major organizations, and speaking directly in their own voices instead of through carefully managed palace statements. Which brings us to the latest media frenzy, sparked by commentary from Richard Eden, suggesting that invitations to diplomatic events signal an establishment plot to welcome them back into the royal fold. A claim that sounds dramatic until you remember that high-profile global figures are invited to diplomatic gatherings all the time, especially when their work intersects with international issues. And attending an event does not equal rejoining an institution. It simply means they are still influential enough to be included in important conversations. And influence is the key word here, because influence is exactly what they retained after stepping down: the ability to draw attention to issues, to mobilize public interest, to bring cameras and coverage to places and people who might otherwise be overlooked. And that kind of influence does not vanish just because someone is no longer a royal worker. If anything, independence can amplify it because there are fewer constraints on what can be said or supported. And this is why the idea of a return feels increasingly detached from reality, because returning would not just be a change of job title, it would mean surrendering autonomy, re-entering a rigid hierarchy, accepting limitations on public speech, and once again becoming subject to the very structures they chose to leave behind. And when you frame it like that, the question stops being, why wouldn't they come back, and becomes, why would they ever give up the freedom they fought to gain? Because what they have now is something rare: the ability to design their own path of public service without being bound by centuries-old protocol, to choose causes based on urgency rather than tradition, to speak when they want, where they want, how they want. And that level of control is not something people willingly surrender, especially after experiencing life without it. So when commentators speculate about reconciliation or reintegration, it often says more about the needs of the institution than about the intentions of Harry and Meghan themselves, because institutions seek stability and familiar structures, while individuals who have already built new lives rarely feel compelled to step backward into old roles. And Alicia's calm intervention exposed that disconnect in a way that was impossible to spin. She didn't attack, she didn't speculate, she simply pointed out the obvious. They are already doing the work, already making an impact, already operating on the global stage without public funding, without palace oversight, without waiting for permission. And if that is the case, then the narrative that they need to return starts to look less like a realistic possibility and more like wishful thinking from those who cannot accept that the monarchy no longer has exclusive ownership over the concept of royal-style public service. Because service, compassion, advocacy, these things do not belong to any institution. They belong to the people who choose to practice them. And Harry and Meghan have shown that they intend to continue practicing them on their own terms, which leads to a conclusion that some commentators seem determined to avoid acknowledging. The story is not about a dramatic comeback, it is about a permanent shift, a redefinition of what their roles in the world actually are. And once that shift happens, there is no reset button that takes everything back to how it was before. And if there is one thing that becomes unmistakably clear when you step back and look at the bigger picture, it is that the fascination with pulling Harry and Meghan back into royal life is fueled less by evidence and more by discomfort with the idea that they succeeded outside of it, because their independence challenges a long-standing assumption that relevance, visibility, and influence must flow through the monarchy. Yet here they are proving that a different model is possible, one where global advocacy can exist beyond palace walls, where humanitarian work can be funded privately, where public figures can engage directly with communities and organizations without layers of protocol dictating every move. And this is precisely why every diplomatic invitation, every international appearance, every meeting with world leaders or nonprofit partners gets reinterpreted as a sign of impending return rather than what it actually represents. Proof that they built a parallel platform that operates independently but still intersects with global affairs. And the more successful that platform becomes, the harder it is to maintain the illusion that they are somehow incomplete without royal duties. Because completeness was never about titles, it was about purpose. And purpose is something they clearly continue to pursue, whether through their foundation, their partnerships, or their public engagements. Which is why Alicia's question echoes so powerfully now. What exactly would be the appeal of going back? What would they gain that they do not already have? More restrictions, more scrutiny, less control, fewer opportunities to speak freely, a return to the same environment that once left them feeling trapped and unsafe. Because let's be honest, reintegration would not magically erase the past. It would place them right back into a system that has shown little sign of fundamental change, and expecting a different outcome under the same conditions would defy common sense. Yet the narrative persists because it is comforting to imagine tidy resolutions, dramatic reconciliations, a neat ending where everyone returns to their assigned roles and harmony is restored. But real life rarely follows those scripts, especially when the people involved have already rewritten their own. And Harry and Meghan's story since stepping back has been one of deliberate forward motion, not hesitation, not nostalgia, not preparation for a comeback. They have invested years into building new professional relationships, new initiatives, new media ventures, new philanthropic strategies, all of which point toward a long-term vision that exists outside the monarchy rather than orbiting around it. And dismantling that vision to resume ceremonial duties would not just be impractical, it would undermine the very independence they worked to establish. So when commentators frame a potential return as inevitable or desirable, they overlook the most important factor of all: agency. The fact that Harry and Meghan have the power to choose their own future, and everything they have done suggests that their choice is to continue forward, not backward, to expand their global reach rather than narrow it, to speak openly rather than cautiously, to engage directly rather than through intermediaries. And once you recognize that, the speculation starts to feel less like informed analysis and more like an echo of a past that no longer defines them. Because the truth is, they are no longer supporting characters in someone else's institutional story. They are the authors of their own. And authors rarely hand the pen back after discovering they can write freely. Which brings us to the uncomfortable realization at the heart of this entire conversation. The question was never whether they could return, it was whether they would want to. And all available evidence points to the same answer. They have moved on, not in anger, not in exile, but in evolution, building a life that aligns with their values, their priorities, and their vision for service in a modern world, a life that does not require royal validation to be meaningful or impactful. And as long as that life continues to grow, the calls for their return will sound increasingly disconnected from reality, like echoes from a chapter that has already ended. Because sometimes the most dramatic decision is not leaving, it is choosing never to go back, choosing to keep walking forward even when others insist on looking behind. And that is the story unfolding now, not a prelude to reconciliation, not a suspenseful wait for a comeback, but the steady, deliberate continuation of a path they chose for themselves, a path that leads away from the constraints of royal life and toward a broader stage where their influence is defined not by titles, but by actions, not by tradition, but by impact. And once that path is established, once momentum builds, once independence becomes the norm rather than the exception, turning around stops being an option and starts being an irrelevance. because the future they are creating does not require a return to the past. It only requires the determination to keep moving forward. And that is exactly what they appear to be doing, step by step, project by project, appearance by appearance, proving with each passing moment that the era of waiting for them to come back may exist in headlines and commentary, but not in